The railway had been built through the mountains because commerce required it, not because the mountains permitted it. The line ran through high country where winters arrived early and stayed late, where snow was measured in feet per week and wind was not a secondary concern but a primary force. The railway had operated through previous winters without catastrophic failure. That record was taken as proof the line could handle what came. It was only proof that the right conditions had not yet arrived. On the morning the train departed, snow was falling at a rate the railway had managed before. The crew signed on for a run they had made many times in weather that looked exactly like this. The mountain waited. The first signs were not dramatic. Snow was heavier in certain cuts, lighter in the open stretches. The crew noted the unevenness and continued. What they were seeing was wind transport, snow lifted off the exposed ridges above and carried down into the protected cuts below, deposited wherever the moving air slowed and dropped its load. The cuts were filling faster than they had filled before. The railway's clearing operations were designed for ordinary accumulation. What was building in the cuts along this section of line was not ordinary. It was continuous, sustained, and directed by terrain geometry into exactly the places where the track ran. By the time anyone with authority to act had clear information, the train was already deep in the mountain section. The train felt the snow before the crew could measure it. Resistance through the throttle, a drag that grew heavier by the mile. The engineer opened the throttle further. Doctrine was clear: keep moving. A stopped locomotive in deep snow could not restart. So he kept the wheels turning and the steam up and pushed forward into cuts where the walls had risen above the roofline of the cars. The snow outside was no longer weather at a distance. It was material pressed close on both sides. The locomotive was still moving, but it was moving through a volume of snow that was actively and continuously refilling behind and ahead of it. The end of the difficult section was not getting closer. It was disappearing. The train stopped. Not with a jolt, with a slow, total, irreversible settling into stillness. The driving wheels spun against packed snow and found nothing to grip. The locomotive could make steam. It could not move. Behind the train, the section it had passed through was already filling. The crew could watch it happen in real time from the rear car. Wind-carried snow pouring into the cut, packing into the passage the train had forced, erasing it. The route was sealed in both directions. There were no rotary plows on this section. They were men with hand tools somewhere, unreachable. The crew had fuel and heat and water in the tender. They were not in immediate danger. They were simply stopped, in the cold, in a silence that only deep snow produces, waiting. Snow that falls in still air is one problem. Snow that falls into wind is another. At elevation, snow rarely stays where it lands. Wind picks it up and carries it, sometimes for miles, depositing it wherever the air slows. Terrain controls where the air slows. A cut blasted through a ridge for a railway becomes, under the right conditions, a collection point. Moving air passes over the open cut. Still air sits inside it. Snow suspended in the moving air drops at the boundary and fills the void below. The rate depends on wind velocity, the size of the source terrain above, and how long the conditions hold. When those factors align, the accumulation rate exceeds anything a 19th century railway could clear. That is what happened here. The cuts collected. The wind did not stop. The locomotive was not designed for what the terrain and the weather produced together. What followed this event, and others like it on mountain lines throughout the era, was a reckoning with terrain. The snow shed was the primary answer, a structure built over the most vulnerable cuts so wind-transported snow passed over the track rather than into it. Rotary plow equipment gave railways clearing capacity that hand tools never could. Communication and dispatch protocols were revised. None of it came without cost. It came because something had to stop moving in the mountains before the people responsible understood what they were dealing with. The train was eventually freed. The locomotive moved out under its own power, but over the worst cuts on that route they built the sheds, long dark timber structures against the cliff face, open on one side, closed on the mountainside where the drifts built and slid past. They stand in the places where the cuts used to be open to the sky. The wind moves over them. The snow goes somewhere else. The crew did not panic. That is worth saying plainly, because the condition they were in, sealed inside a buried train on a mountain in a storm with no certainty of when help would arrive, was the kind of condition that invites panic. They did not indulge it. They had work to do. The firebox required tending. Steam pressure had to be maintained, not for movement, but for heat. A locomotive that goes cold in deep snow is a locomotive whose crew goes cold with it, and cold at elevation in a sustained winter storm is its own emergency. So the fireman worked the fire. The engineer monitored pressure. The passengers, if there were any in the coaches behind, were kept informed in the way railway crews of the era kept people informed, which is to say with measured words and as little detail as would produce alarm. The waiting had a physical character. The snow pressed against the cars with a weight that was not loud but was present, a compression that changed the quality of sound inside the train, muffled it, flattened it. Men spoke and their voices did not carry the way voices carry in open air. The world outside had been reduced to white at every window. Time passed in the way time passes when there is nothing to measure it against except the fire and the pressure gauge and the slow consumption of fuel in the tender. They had enough. They had been in difficult situations on mountain lines before. They understood that the storm would moderate, that men would come with tools, that the track beneath them was intact. They waited with the patience of men who had chosen work that sometimes asked this of them. The relief effort began before the full extent of the blockage was known. Word reached the nearest station by telegraph, where service held, and by rider where it did not. The information that came through was incomplete. A train was stopped in the mountain section. Snow was heavy. The precise location and the depth of the accumulation around the locomotive were not confirmed for several hours. What the railway could dispatch was men and hand tools, and, where the grade and the track ahead of the blockage permitted, a locomotive with a wedge plow to push toward the stopped train from the far end. The men with shovels went to work at the margins of the affected section, where the accumulation was deep but not impenetrable, opening a path by degrees. This was slow work. Packed wind-driven snow is not the light powder of an open field. It has been compressed by its own weight and by the force of the air that deposited it. A shovel driven into it meets resistance. The work is heavy, and the progress is measured in feet per hour, not in any larger unit. The wedge plow, pushing from the far end, made better progress where the cuts were shallower, but stalled in the same conditions that had stopped the original train. It could not reach the buried locomotive by direct approach. The clearing, therefore, proceeded from both ends toward the middle, with the stopped train as the fixed point that everyone was moving toward. It took the time it took. When the shovels finally reached the locomotive and the men cleared the snow from around the running gear, what they found confirmed what the engineer had known from the moment the wheels lost traction. The machine was undamaged. The track was undamaged. The snow had simply been in a quantity and a location that the railway had no ready answer for. The locomotive backed out under its own power when the path was clear. The men watched it go.